the outgoing Defence Minister James Heappey has slammed the government's defence policy, arguing that some in government are just hoping threats to the UK will simply go away.
Well, meanwhile, Heappey called on ministers to do more to get ready for conflict, saying the UK has failed to prepare for war.
Well, the former head of the British Army, Lord Dannat, joins us now. Thank you so much for making the time for us this morning. Frankly, what are the risks that the United Kingdom potentially faces right now?
Well, I think the issue that James Heappey highlighted and Ben Wallace supported, and indeed Lord Sedwell also had an interesting piece in The Independent yesterday. What they're all pointing up, and many of us have been saying this for a while, is that looking at the situation in Europe, the security situation in Europe, with Russia's aggression against Ukraine being the predominant factor at the present moment, it makes sense for a country like ourselves to think about the worst, to prepare for the worst, to make sure that we're in a good place if the worst should happen. Now, none of us want the worst should happen, and by the worst, I mean getting involved in a war. And the issue that James Heappey was pointing up was that the Ministry of Defence alone was the only government department, he said, that was taking preparations for potential conflict seriously. And he highlighted the fact that a major exercise had been planned a little while ago, which all government departments are required, or should have been required, to take part in, to test the country's procedures for how to respond in the event of a major crisis and attack. And other government departments just failed to turn up. He perfectly reasonably said that this actually indicated that we're not taking these things sufficiently seriously.
Yeah, and it sort of begs the question, doesn't it, whether we've learnt the lessons of COVID, when we heard all of the sort of preparations for a pandemic had been almost sort of ignored for a while by successive governments, and here we are talking about all these threats around the world, and are the government making those preparations that we deserve as citizens? And to hear from you sharing those concerns, I suppose, adds weight to that. I mean, how alarmed should we be? Is this rectifiable? Do you think that the government's taking this seriously now? Do you think that Lord Cameron, as our Foreign Secretary, has a role to play in all of this as well?
Well, we'd be worried, we should be worried, if the government didn't respond to these criticisms and didn't rise to the challenge. Now, what this needs, and currently, without being unreasonable about it, it shows a failure of leadership. If there are potential crises, you mentioned COVID, and of course, that was something we had to struggle our way through. And leadership there was pretty iffy at times. But if you look at the worst outcome of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, if Russia should prevail against Ukraine, and then Russia should push against other NATO countries, we could find ourselves in a very serious set of circumstances here in this country. But what it needs is for number 10, the Prime Minister of the day, to absolutely crack the whip across government and say, right, back in the Cold War years, we had good plans in this country to know how we would respond in a crisis. We've got a well-constructed government control bunker. We need to exercise this. We need to get what's called the war book refreshed and sorted out again, and make sure that we're serving the people of our country properly by having right across government, right across all government departments, proper plans from central government down to local government to reassure the people that if the worst comes to the worst, we know how to respond. And part of that, of course, and you probably know what I'm going to say next, is we need to increase our spending on our defence. And that means increasing the defence budget from 2.2% through 2.5% to 3%. And some would even say, and I would echo that, going up to 4%, which is sort of where we were in the Cold War, to make sure that we are properly looking after the defence and the infrastructure of this country, to make sure that we can look after the people of this country should the worst come to the worst.
You mentioned the Cold War, and thank goodness it did not turn hot. Perhaps one of the reasons it didn't was this policy pursued by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher of peace through strength. The very fact of having the capability to fight a war, warding off the prospect of war itself. It seems like we've entered into a different paradigm now, whereby both major parties in the United Kingdom are almost pursuing the opposite policy, ignoring the need for a strong military. Would that be your assessment?
Tom, I think you described it perfectly well. The reason why the Cold War never turned hot was because we increased our defence capability, both nuclear and conventional capability, particularly during the 1980s, as you pointed quite correctly, to the leadership of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, to the point that the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact realized that they couldn't compete, and indeed the Cold War ended satisfactorily. I'd also say we were spending between 4 and 5% of GDP at that time. And although that sounds like an awful lot of money, and I've made this point before, parallels with the 1930s are not unreasonable. In 1935, we spent less than 3% of GDP and tried to appease Hitler. When war broke out, because appeasement failed, in 1939, that had shot up to 18%. And in 1940, when we were fighting for our lives, it was 46%. That's the disastrous price of fighting a war. What we have to do is pay the premium to deter war. And I think that premium is currently now about 3 or 4% of GDP. That's what we should be rising up to. It needs leadership across the country to get the government to act cohesively. And I'm afraid whoever is Prime Minister this time next year needs to realize there are serious issues on the international horizon, and that should be his or her top priority.
Yeah. I'm so pleased you're on the programme because, I mean, I've quoted those articles that you're referring to ministers on this programme multiple times, these linkages that you made to sort of pre-Second World War and the Cold War as well, and they always come back. And in fact, we had Mel Stride, the Department for Work and Pension Secretary of State a moment ago, saying the exact same thing. We've got record spending in defence, higher than ever. We're spending more now than ever, higher than, and I just wanted to get your response to what, when I give them your argument, that's what they come back at me with. What would you like to say in response to that?
Well, if you're just looking at the sort of the cash, then of course they're absolutely right. But 20 years ago, things were a lot cheaper. And now the price of everything has gone up. And the price of defence equipment has gone up. So to just rely on saying, well, 50 billion is the maximum we've ever spent in recent times, of course that is absolutely right. But you have to come back to the issue of proportion of GDP. We're spending 2.2% at the present moment. And I've already made the case that we bought peace through the Cold War at 4 to 5% of GDP. Those are the sort of figures we should be looking at. Now, of course, people can point to waste and to poor spending in defence procurement, and that is something that the government has got to bear down on. The Public Accounts Committee have criticised the MOD, and the Defence Select Committee have criticised the MOD. So the MOD can do better at the way it spends the money it's given. But the fact of the matter is the quantum, in proportionate terms, is not sufficient to guarantee the security that the people of this country deserve.